But the question is where this weight loss comes from. And clearly, a significant part, if weight loss is too quick, is also loss of protein mass, basically of muscle mass. And that is really problematic because if you think of energy expenditure, so really you want to maintain body weight, the muscles are those parts of the body which probably have a huge contribution to using energy. So you have less body, less muscles, you need less food, you need to eat less, you need to adjust. And actually, it's actually bad for the body because the musculature is very important, particularly with older age. If the body goes into a more starvation-like phenotype. And this is really something which is a big problem.
Welcome to Salad with a Side of Fries. I'm your host, Jenn Trepeck, talking wellness and weight loss for real life. We're here to clear up the myths, misinformation, bad science, and marketing to teach you how to eat and how to cheat. Are you ready? I'm having salad with a side of fries. Hi, friend. Welcome back to Salad with a Side of Fries. I'm Jenn Trepeck, your host and health coach, here with you every week for wellness without the weirdness. Now, if you tune in often, you know that I geek out on the science. And my experience, both in my own health and weight management saga and what I've seen in almost 18 years of working with clients, the difference between knowing what to do and actually doing it is understanding why. And what's more, I think understanding the science and biology of it all also helps us understand what's happening in the body. And as I often say, then we can be on the same team as our bodies rather than feeling like it's doing this thing that we don't understand. So with all of that said, in November of 2024, I read an article about a recently published study saying that our fat cells have a memory. And needless to say, I was very intrigued. I went digging to learn more to find out who was behind this study. Well, friends, I found him. I invited him to have a conversation with all of us here. So let me introduce you. He has been assistant professor of the Institute of Food, Nutrition, and Health at the ETH Zurich since January 2019. He studied biochemistry at the TU Munich, Germany, before moving to ETH Zurich for his PhD to study metabolism and type 2 diabetes. After his graduation, he joined Professor Wolf Reich at Babraham Institute in Cambridge, UK. I hope I'm not butchering all of these names. And investigated, I know, you're like, kind of. Investigated epigenetic mechanisms during development and aging. In 2017, he joined King's College London as a group leader and research fellow, and then moved in 2019 to ETH Zurich, where he was appointed assistant professor for nutrition and metabolic epigenetics. Right up our alley. His research focuses on the relationship between nutrition, metabolism, and the epigenome, with the aim to contribute to the development of novel strategies to combat obesity and metabolic disease. You see why I couldn't wait to connect with him. Please help me welcome Professor Dr. Ferdinand von Meyenn.
Thank you.
How are you?
Thanks. Happy to be here. I'm looking forward to a chat.
Yes, I am apologizing for my very American pronunciations.
That's all good. I think I apologize for my very German pronunciation, which you will likely find.
Okay, perfect. So I just want to say at the beginning, thank you for being here, for having this conversation with us. And the research that you're doing, it's fascinating. And, we'll talk more about it. But thank you for taking the time.
No, it's great. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. So before we get into it, we have to tell our members what they're getting this week. So members, your recipe this week is, okay, it's so good. It is 10 minutes, start to finish, maybe even less. It could be like 8 minutes. Features a fiber-packed vegetable that's coming into season now. The recipe is for roasted artichoke hearts. So you can use them as a side. You could throw a few on top of a salad, even make them as an appetizer. It's so easy and delicious. So if you want this recipe, be sure you're a member. Go to glow.fm/salad with a side of fries. For just $10 a month, you get weekly recipes, a monthly article or tool, extra discounts from me and our partners, plus access to live Q&A sessions. It's a total deal. I say it all the time. It's a steal when you take advantage of the full offerings. And as I'm recording this, I'm realizing it's March, the third month of quarter. which means it's time for your quarterly live Q&A. So I will put that info in there too for you in your email this Friday. When you take advantage of the full offerings, when you do that one-on-one, you save far more than that $10 cost. It is a no-brainer way to show yourself that your health is a priority. Plus, being a member supports this podcast and this community so we can continue to bring you new episodes and experts every week. So head over to glow.fm/salad with a side of fries, or just click the link below in the episode notes. Once you're there, you click the little I agree, and then support now, enter your email and payment info, click subscribe, and you're all set. You'll get this week's recipe for the roasted artichoke hearts and details for your quarterly live Q&A. We're going to do it as a one-on-one because you guys tend to like those better. Okay, let's start with what brought you to this research on fat cells and metabolism and epigenetics and all these things. So, we heard your background, but how did it bring you to these topics?
I think it's the overall interest in biomedical research and ultimately, but particularly because you see that all around. Basically, I think everybody has heard of a friend, of a colleague who has been dieting and at the end not managed to maintain body weight. And we interested in long-term effects, thinking about this idea that the body is not just reacting now to what we do, but actually maybe there's a long-term effect we know from aging. We just thought, is there more to it? And if there is it maybe epigenetics? And if that's the case, that's really what we are interested and want to look for.
And so with this study in particular, you explained that the first thing you did was look at the visceral adipose tissue or the visceral fat cells from bariatric surgery patients.
Exactly.
Right? So what led you to that? Like, what was the hypothesis or what led you to that piece and choosing that as what you were going to look at?
So the whole thing started that we had a number of clinical collaborators that we worked together and also interacted quite often. And they obviously had these cases, and you can find in the literature that people who are severely overweight, so basically living with obesity for a longer period of time, they at some point fail to lose weight with normal strategies. Just changing lifestyle doesn't work. And so that's the point where then many times they get a bariatric surgery. And despite that being a very significant intervention, which really restricts how much food you can take in, people lose weight for a while, for a good while, and yet then some of them recover some of that body weight. And so somehow there must be an intrinsic mechanism that really dislikes that, let's go that way. And that's the point where we started. And so having these clinical collaborators, they, at the time when they did these studies, had the chance to also collect some of these fat samples. And so we got access to them. In particular, one of these studies also allowed us to look 2 years after the initial surgery, again, at the same tissue, which is inside of the body. So basically, you have to have an operation for that. And so that was a unique resource and a unique sample set. And then we went ahead and really tried to understand what changes during weight gain, during obesity, or basically while people are living with obesity, and vice versa after they've lost weight, and compared that to lean people that we got also samples from other type of surgeries.
And then this is sort of a tangential question, but defining obesity, did you guys use BMI? How did we, obviously, a bariatric surgery patient, has to meet certain qualifications for that. But what did you guys use then, even in later parts of your research, to qualify, obesity?
Actually, because in that case, as you mentioned, the people that were recruited and part of these studies, they were living with obesity and had a significant higher BMI. I think nowadays we are moving more and more towards using the waist to hip ratio as a measure of overweight. But I think there's a few exceptions also now with the new regulation or the new kind of suggestion that have been made that obviously for more severe cases, BMI still applies. At a certain BMI, that still is a good way. And in our case, most of them had a BMI over 30 prior to bariatric surgery. So in that case, this classification is much simpler. And so we used that. And in the case also because we were looking at the adipose tissue from the visceral tissue, so that's the mental adipose tissue inside the organs or surrounding the organs, that one is also many times implicated with more metabolic disadvantages or metabolic problems. And so here we really tried then to understand what is dysregulated there.
Got it. And so what did you find?
So I think some of the results were in line with what other people also have reported prior, particularly during weight gain, or basically once people are living with obesity, the adipose tissue changes. And that may not be so surprising because obviously it has now accumulated a lot of extra fat, it's really grown. And so what we find that here the tissue somewhat enters a state of a bit more inflammation. And I think that's also been reported by others. And we really can nicely reproducible find that. Also how fats are metabolized, how fats are then processed in this adipose tissue changes. The surprising fact was now when we looked at those individuals who have been living with obesity after weight loss and then compare them to lean individuals. And here what we find is that many of these molecular changes that they acquire during the weight gain remain there, despite that they are physiologically. So basically, if you look at them, they're obviously much leaner. Their cardiometabolic health has improved, glucose levels have dropped. So really, they are much healthier. And yet, in the adipose tissue, we still find lots of these signatures which would otherwise indicate they are living with obesity.
And those, signatures, as you call them, was a change in the RNA inside the cell, correct?
Exactly. So what we did, this is human samples and this clinical samples, which normally they are frozen, so there's limited way you can analyze them. And what we can do, we can look at which genes are active. We look there at the so-called RNA. That's basically when from the DNA, we make the RNA, which is then needed to make the proteins. And so we can compare now the various RNAs. And we can very specifically now look at RNAs from different cell types. And so we are mostly interested in the adipocytes, so those cells which can store fat. And here we really find that there's many more genes deregulated, or there's many genes deregulated from those who have been living with obesity. And these are really maintained. And I think it's noteworthy here, these people have lost weight for years, 2 years, and still they have the signatures which correspond to those signatures they had when they were living with obesity. So really, this is somehow maintained there. And maybe also just to say that these RNAs, they are produced normally quite rapidly. They normally have a very short half-life, so they are only there for maybe days, maybe a couple of days in the maximum, sometimes even only minutes. So this is not something that was generated while they were living with obesity. These really are made all the time de novo, and so they really remain there. And there must be probably another underlying mechanism. And that's actually what we then went on, because we said, in humans, we're obviously somewhat limited in how far we can molecular understand these mechanisms. And here we have the big advantage that with many animal models, we can really mimic that. And so we looked for a model that would be as close as possible reflecting this weight gain and weight loss that we see, and maybe even then ultimately have similar effects, we might call the yo-yo effect. And the mouse, kind of an animal, the rodent that people use in the lab, that's also what we then use, because these animals can be fed a diet which is very much reflecting what we would call a Western diet. High in fat, high caloric diet. And so if you feed that you could also feed it to a pet, to a dog, but also in our case to the mice, they very quickly gain weight, very similar like humans. And doing that, we basically repeated experiments. We fed them for several months. These mice became obese. And then we just said, okay, now we give them a healthier diet. We get them a diet high in fiber, lower calories, and then they very rapidly lose weight, as you would do with a normal nutritional intervention. And similar to what we found in the humans, also here looking now at the RNAs in the fat cells themselves, we find that during this weight gain, there's many genes activated which are related to more inflammation, to kind of deregulation of how the fats are processed and metabolized in these fat cells. And many of these changes are still there after weight loss, where also these mice are, from the phenotype, much healthier.
And so translating that into, the idea that there's the regain of weight, it's your, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? But it's your understanding or the conclusion that this change in the RNA inside the cell predisposes these people to essentially regain the weight because their cells are signaling for the obesogenic environment that they became used to.
Ultimately, I think that's part of what we believe is the case. But we even went a step further. So because we said, and as I tried to mention before, these RNAs are normally very short-lived. And so we are an epigenetics lab. So we really are interested in those mechanisms which regulate which genes are active, so which RNAs are made and what are kind of the underlying mechanisms for that. It's basically, if you think of a book, you mark which page you want to read and you put a small note in there, and the page you don't like, you cross them out. And similar here, with the epigenetic modification of marks, we can indicate which parts are relevant. And so that way, kind of reading this page of the book would be like making that RNA and make it available. And this we could do now very nicely again in our animal model, because here we can isolate very specifically these fat cells. They are fresh, which we need them to be for our epigenetic analysis. And if we do that, we find that also, similar like the RNA, many epigenetic signatures are changing during the weight gain. And similarly, these are also maintained. They're long-term there. So certain regions which basically were only marked in the obese state, this mark remains there. While in a lean, non-obese mouse that has never been obese, these never got marked. And so it seems like the body, in particular the fat cells, have responded to this obesogenic environment by activating certain parts of the genome, by kind of using that to probably kind of address that, or so to speak, adapt to that obesogenic environment. And during the weight loss, this was not removed. And so suddenly we have now these cells which are phenotypically, or these mice phenotypically resembling a lean mouse, but is then experimentally nexted. If we now re-expose them, we put them back in an obesogenic environment, they very quickly regain weight, much faster than those animals which have never seen this obesogenic environment beforehand. And so a little bit fitting to this idea of this yo-yo effect, that if you now have presented food, now your body responds differently, you much faster regain weight. We even then went a step ahead. We could isolate from these mice these fat cells specifically, and then test, do they respond differently than fat cells from mice which have never been obese. And here we find that what maybe somewhere we would speculating or think that could be the case, fat cells from prior obese mice are much better in taking in glucose, much better in taking in fat and storing that. And again, this is likely now a consequence of epigenetic changes driving transcription, also the RNA levels, that then does that. Just a note, just to say from a more scientific perspective, we obviously have not done the inverse experiment where we kind of remove that signature. Just technically, this is not that easy possible. That probably is something we are working on, kind of to have a final, maybe a bit more academic proof that this is really the causative reason why that happens. But I still believe our data indicates that the body adapts and the fat cells change during obesity. Many of these changes are maintained even after weight loss, and these are likely contributing to the effect of this yo-yo effect that we find.
It's so interesting. And perhaps to help everybody, a little bit of, I mean, we've talked about epigenetics before, but I'd love to hear how you explain it and, you know, put it into context for this so everybody's really with us and what what you're finding.
So if you look at every individual person that we have here or around, genetically, everyone is unique and has a unique genetic code. And so basically, we are not very different, but the small pieces are different. Yet, if you think of the individual body, if you think of yourself, you obviously have skin, you have your liver, you have the eyes, and they have all exactly the same genetic information. So how does now every cell and every tissue in our body know that what it should do? And that's where the epigenetic process comes in place. That's basically of this genetic code, the DNA that every cell carries, different parts are active and other parts are not active. And the epigenetic code is, like before tried to say, like a book where you label, where you mark certain pages to be active and other pages you kind of say they're not being used. And if you think now this book would be like a construction book or like an IKEA booklet where it tells you how to build up a floor plan, and you have now all of them, you likely only would want to have the parts that you need in every cell. You wouldn't want in the kitchen to build up the toilet. And so along those lines, you can imagine you only would want to use the part of this plan in the correct tissue as you have it. And that's where the epigenetic comes in. That normally happens during development. So basically while from the initial fertilization until we are born and even beyond of that. The important part here is also now the body can respond to environmental cues, to changes in metabolism, to many effects that we have. And again, here, these changes will instruct some epigenetic changes. And what I think we now found, and I think that's maybe the part that is interesting here, or really relevant, is that these changes, once put on there, are not only acute, they can really be long-lasting, really maintained there. And so we probably need a stimulus, some signal to put them on in the first place. But how they go away, that is something we don't understand that well always.
Yeah. And, hopefully your future research will bring us some of that. Any other conclusions before we shift into sort of how to take your conclusions and translate them into things for us on the daily basis? What are some of any other key conclusions that you've drawn from this study and looking at this visceral adipose tissue?
So I think the very first part, what is important to say is weight loss overall was very beneficial, both in humans and both in the mice. Losing weight massively improved their health. And so I think this is a key observation, not necessarily ours, but I think it really reinforces that it's worthwhile doing that. And so there's, despite that memory that probably is now in the adipose tissue and maybe also in other cells, as I can mention in a second, it still is really worthwhile doing that because it seems like at this weight, after weight loss and maintaining that weight loss has this beneficial effect. So these epigenetic signatures which are maintained are not necessarily so strong that they would drive disease or pathophysiological states. And I think this is really important also for people remembering. Just because it's hard, it's still good. The other side, which is also worthwhile noting, that we have these, and they are really can be long-term there. So adipocytes, for example, they in humans are believed to live up to 10 years. So if you now think of how to get rid of that, this is the part which is maybe a little bit can be frustrating. We don't have yet found a way to erase it. We have not found that in these periods that we looked at in humans, several years, 2-3 years, in mice, several months, this goes away. So these seem to be rather stable and probably newer ways of interventions might be needed. And then the final thing, and this is maybe a little bit more speculation at this point, is we believe that we have found, or basically what we know, what we have found is in the fat cells, in the adipose tissue, we find these changes. But if we think of now body weight regulation and many metabolic processes, the adipose tissue is very important, but it's not everything. And so this is probably a part of the whole story. And we are now starting also exploring, and likely other groups, to understand, are similar changes, similar memories established maybe in the brain, in the feeding circuits, maybe in the liver, maybe in the muscle, that also contribute to that phenotype. And I think that all together obviously with structural changes, will over time paint a much clearer picture of what happens during weight gain, weight loss, and how this all is orchestrated.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating. And I want to, like I said, shift into some of the implications of this and how even these findings play in the sandbox with other things that we already know, even like GLP-1 medications and all that kind of stuff. So we'll shift there, but let's pause to highlight our partner for this episode. Big thanks to DNA Miracles for supporting Salad with a Side of Fries. Because every child is a miracle, DNA Miracles provides the highest quality body and wellness products designed for babies, children, and expectant mothers. All products are gentle, easy to use, and 100% effective when used as directed. DNA Miracles partner with leading health professionals and scientists who follow the highest standards in ingredient selection to create the most effective skin, hair, and health solutions. As natural as possible, DNA Miracles is the best and safest option on the market for you and your little miracle. From expert pediatricians to real family testimonials, everyone has fallen in love with DNA Miracles. So a key takeaway from today's episode is that we want to create a metabolically healthy environment. And one way to do that, and we can do that for the littles in our lives, is to give them high quality nutrition. And that might be a high quality multivitamin to fill in the gaps where their nutrition falls short. DNA Miracles has options to support your child's needs for a multivitamin, but I actually want to highlight the DNA Miracles chewable probiotic. So each chewable tablet delivers 5 billion bacteria. It supports immune health, a healthy GI tract, teeth, and gums. I actually use it too for my gums. So for adults, it's a chewable. So chewing it or letting it dissolve in your mouth is a great option. And it really doesn't have much of a flavor. So it's not going to cause a whole to-do to get them to chew it. Plus, it's only $37.95. And that's before your 10% off and free shipping for being a Salad with a Side of Fries listener. To get 10% off and free shipping, text the word miracles, MIRACLES, to 844-947-4846. You'll receive the link and coupon code right to your phone. Again, simply text the word miracles, MIRACLES, to 844-947-4846. This is a toll-free number. Standard text and data rates may apply. Okay, Ferdinand, to me, and when I looked at your study and we had our other conversation about all of this, it feels like this explains, as you were even mentioning, the yo-yo effect and what I had talked about in an episode in fall of 2024 about relapse rate or the likelihood of regaining weight. And I discussed it more from the behavioral side. To me, this is almost like the physiological side of that conversation. And I think this is connected to the set point idea that people have heard. I think there's also a piece potentially of how we go about, quote unquote, losing the weight might play into this too. What are your thoughts on, all of those pieces?
So maybe the very first thing, quickly saying, I don't think we have explained it. We try to find some potential molecular mechanism to it.
Sure.
Because I think that the causality is
You are the scientist. Yes, I appreciate it.
Sometimes, maybe from a more look at it, one feels like, why should it not explain? But I think we explain it would be a step beyond of that. You mentioned a little bit before, so the GLPs, the semaglutide, all of these ones. I think there what is interesting to see is that they also don't induce long-lasting effects once you withdraw them. As long as you take them, they seem to be fantastic. But I think, and this is probably at the moment where more and more people are looking at, we have these potential effects on not only, we lose weight, but the question is where this weight loss comes from. And clearly, a significant part, if weight loss is too quick, is also loss of protein mass, basically of muscle mass. And that is really problematic because if you think of energy expenditure, so really you want to maintain body weight, the muscles are those parts of the body which probably have a huge contribution to using energy. So you have less body, less muscles, you need less food, you need to eat less, you need to adjust. And actually, it's actually bad for the body because the musculature is very important, particularly with older age, preventing falling, all of these effects you have. And this is really something which is a big problem if the body goes into a more starvation-like phenotype. Then we really have the situation that particularly the brain is really dependent on glucose. And if we don't have enough carbs supplying the body, then suddenly the body must generate them. The fat tissue has in somewhat a problem. The fat cannot be converted to glucose. So that means the body needs somewhere to find a way to make glucose. And the only way it can do it, if really we go into a complete starvation-like phenotype, is you use your muscles, the proteins, because they can be reconverted into glucose. But that obviously means you have to reuse them. And at the same time, you basically produce more ketone bodies, which are coming from the fat tissue. But overall, this is not a very sustainable way. It's really the biggest part or a good part will be the loss of the muscle mass. I think so in that way, this has to be controlled. And in many cases, this may even contribute to that when people regain weight, you also want to regain muscle mass. And that really is probably a system which is not ideal. The other side, where are we probably finding this difference? And then you meant the psychological side, all of that. I think if we look at the effects of glucose of food in general, and if you think of if you're food deprived, this really is a stress for the body. And also, I think at some point, you will be starting thinking only about food.
Right. So for everybody listening, before we started recording, we were talking about the Minnesota starvation experiment. And that's kind of what you're saying right now of what those researchers saw in that, their thoughts becoming all-consuming about food.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so basically, I think this is an important thing to consider also here. And particularly then think of the set point theory, meaning that somehow the body has this ideal weight. And I think many studies of the years have been, I'm not sure if you can really say shown, but at least the speculation that there's the set point and that set point is very easily pushed upwards in stress situations during weight gain, but pushing it downwards seems to be very challenging. And maybe here the fat tissue plays again a role because the fat tissue produces a hormone, leptin, and that is somewhat a signal to the brain informing the body and the brain in particular, and also then the food intake circuits, so basically the feeding circuits, how much fat we have. The body will likely wants to maintain. That being said, we have not yet found a therapy where we just would inject more leptin and people would lose weight. This only works in people who are really leptin deficient. We can overcome that. But that doesn't seem to be at this point the way. But clearly we have a lot of interaction, fat tissue to the brain, to many other organs. And so here, we call an endocrine organ, so a hormone producing organ, the fat tissue really plays a big role. But it also goes the other way around. Obviously, the brain signals to many of these tissues and instructs us and changes the functionality and what they are supposed to do. And so I believe psychological effects and then linking it to metabolic effects and overall physiology, I think there's a huge amount of crosstalk. And we are starting to stepwise understand that and trying to work out where are the links, which are the key links, and how do they work.
Yeah. So in thinking about how this plays into choices for people to say, I'm prioritizing my health, I'm prioritizing my metabolic health, my cardiovascular health, I want to make sure that I'm going to do this in a way that is healthful and sustainable, right? Curious, in your opinion, based on, because with the mice versus the bariatric surgery patients, like, can you explain sort of the pace of gaining weight and removing weight and the magnitude in those directions? Like, how much do you think those things play into this?
Yeah. I think it's still a bit of a complicated task to do. So the humans are, as most humans, very individual. And so we actually see that even if you look at the changes that we find, they are very individual. So there's not like one change explains it all. And that's probably because the way they gained weight, the way they lose weight, despite the bariatric surgery, the diet will be different. The amount of exercise they do, all of these things factor in. The mice are very controlled. They're all genetically very similar. They all get exactly the same food. They're sitting in a controlled environment. They also, and this is maybe one thing to consider also when we think of weight loss, most of us humans, probably if they are losing weight, because of the restriction in energy, I think this is really, you basically have to do exercise on top of that. And I think most of the strategy will involve that, but I can imagine that's not necessarily the easiest to do. Mice, they are just very active. I mean, they run around. So we don't see much of a protein and muscle mass loss in our mice. And I think that was something was for us also important because really we wanted to make sure that the phenotype we see is really not just a muscle loss. And I think if you think of a human where you go for very moderate weight loss over a longer period of time, then these effects on protein, on muscle loss are much less than you would go for these really dramatic interventions. And so I think the pace at which weight is lost is quite important. In our study, not something we have actually controlled particular. So in that way, it's hard now to say how much that will affect this memory that we find in the adipose tissue. But from many other studies, I would say there is clearly a strong contribution.
On some level, so satisfying to hear your conclusions and inference based on your research, because I feel like, some of the coaches and doctors that I work with, I feel like we've been screaming this from the rooftops, and everybody wants to be like, what are you talking about? And so there's just a piece of this that says how we go about it, removing fat, building muscle, is potentially even more important than we realize. Because I guess, does it stand to reason? And I know that you haven't looked at this yet, right? But does it stand to reason that if over time in an obesogenic environment, there is this adaptation to that environment, that if we go about, I almost want to say healthifying, right? Okay. Like if we go about building lean muscle mass, removing fat over time, giving the body time to adapt to this metabolically healthier environment, that there's the possibility of easier maintenance, not just because you have more lean muscle mass, but because maybe we're potentially, again, rewriting this marker.
I mean, I would say from a pure physiologic perspective, definitely there's something that I don't see any reason not to like. It's a very German way to say it, I think.
Right.
It's obviously for us at this point hard to know if this memory that has been built up during being obese or living with obesity, how that is actually erased. And so whether it's a very short or very careful way of removing weight, if this is the way, or if it's really very long-term not being overweight, if that's the way to do it, I think I would have to speculate. And I still believe a little bit, I mean, from what we've seen, the epigenome is responding to a stimulus. And basically, obviously, at least to some degree, so we have not proven it. I mean, that's again to say, but I mean, from the way it looks like, this is a way of the cells to coping with the change in environment. And so they deal with that. And so now you just remove that stimulus, but if you do not override that with a new stimulus, which really enforces cells to change again, maybe that's a part why the cells don't have to adapt to a new environment. They just don't. And so basically this stays there, and therefore we have them long-term living that way. And so maybe exercise, particular certain types of exercise, maybe also specific diets which would be changed, could do that. And this is definitely some of these areas we at the moment starting to look more into. I mean, combinatorial ways to change it, maybe even with this new weight loss drugs, because despite the many potential problematic sides that they still have of muscle mass loss, that you need to take them long term, there's no the second, the third generation of these drugs coming to the market. And I think it's going to be very interesting to look at what they do, how they work, and how we can use them. Yet I think in all of these cases, a balanced, a healthy diet will be key, because this is definitely also one of the side effects of many of these semaglutide or Ozempic. People taking those, they eat less, they maybe eat less balanced. We see micronutrient deficiencies. These things we need to balance because they will have severe health implications. And so bringing that in there, I think still will require a lot of work. I would still say that the overall message is still the weight loss per se on many, many levels is beneficial. But I think a very drastic, very quick weight loss may actually not be so good. And so there is also, if you think about weight gaining, which probably doesn't happen from today to in 2 weeks, maybe people should also accept that this can take a bit longer, and actually taking a bit longer might be very beneficial. Yet maybe if you look on the mirror, on the scale, it's slightly less satisfying, but I think you can get there. And maybe one thing, because we briefly touched on that before, but also of this weight loss, obviously what we see, and maybe is a bit of the stigma with many people who are very much challenged with maintaining body weight. And I think this is something with our work, maybe this helps a little bit, this idea that it's actually the body fighting, or in some way we have now a potential explanation, a molecular explanation that could say, well, there is really an intrinsic in the cell, in the body, something that fights against that weight loss and wants to go back to a prior state. And so maybe taking away this pure people are weak of not being able to maintain that body weight, there is something inherently in us that doesn't like that.
1,000%. Yes. And I'm curious, you mentioned leptin, GLP-1, semaglutide, right? These are working on a peptide in the body called GLP-1. And then in thinking about the mice and activity and fat cells as an organ that produce hormones, did you see, or maybe, do you think adiponectin as another hormone that we see very much connected to motility plays into this too?
I mean, we definitely know adiponectin is kind of the good hormone from the adipose tissue. And we did not measure I would now have to check again, but I don't remember that we saw any difference or that we measured it in our samples. But obviously people have looked a lot at adiponectin in its relation to metabolic health. Also, adiponectin is one of those hormones produced by the fat tissue. GLP-1, so basically the Ozempic tries to mimic that's made in the gut. And so again there, which is also, I think, quite interesting because it's a hormone very much produced normally in a normal physiological context in response to food intake. So really signaling again to the body, maybe also likely also to the brain on the energy status that we have and kind of how much food is coming in.
So one of the things that you also said last time we spoke, which is also something I say all the time, is that we could be metabolically healthy at a variety of sizes and vice versa, right? Just being a certain size doesn't mean that we are, this is double negative, but are not metabolically unhealthy, right? So from your expertise, how do we explain that? And how does that play into all of this? Because again, like by these old definitions of obesity, everybody's stuck on body size.
So if we look at that, and kind of we have then to think about what is actually the adipose tissue meant for. If you think of the overall functionality of that, is a sink for excess energy. So if you eat and you don't need the energy, the body evolutionary will not want to waste that energy, because if you think 1,000 years back, maybe not even 1,000 years, a few hundred years, food was scarce. And so when you had it, you wanted to keep it and not just waste it. And so this is the fat tissue, and this applies to every animal. You have excess energy, you store it in the fat tissue. Now we're living in an environment which is slightly changed. Basically, food is everywhere, and using and needing actually all of that extra energy that we can very easily ingest is very hard. And so suddenly now we have this adipose tissue, which is really stressed, or can be stressed basically because there's an excess of energy intake. Yet this tissue is very dynamic. In particular, I mean, we have different adipose tissue depots. We have subcutaneous fat. We have the inter-organ fat, the omental or visceral, which we looked at a lot. And we have even brown fat, which really uses energy to make heat. And so these ones can normally, in a dynamic way, expand. These cells can proliferate, so you can make more cells. They can increase in size, so basically every single cell can store more fat in there. And that's what they should do. So if today you eat another bar of chocolate, then, well, a good part of that will end up somewhere in your adipose tissue and be stored there after the glycogen in the liver and the muscle has been filled up. And that's what it should do. The problem now comes if your adipose tissue reaches a threshold. And that's where this exact threshold is. That's part which we don't yet fully understand. And I think a lot of work goes into that. That's basically the point where it cannot store more of that fat, it's excess energy. And so we then call it as a spillover. And we start seeing so-called ectopic fat, meaning we see suddenly fat accumulation, for example, in the liver. We see fat accumulation in the muscle. And that's the problem. Because at that point, suddenly now these tissues start accumulating that, and that somehow impedes their metabolic function. So they do not normally respond anymore to the levels of insulin. We start seeing some level of insulin resistance, so kind of a pre-diabetic form soon. Glucose levels will rise, and then really this whole metabolic health is kind of affected, and we go beyond of that. But as I said, this can be at different levels. Some people can actually have a increase in body weight, have a much higher BMI, and yet the fat is there where it should be. I mean, we have a good colleague from Cambridge. He says, well, as long as the fat is in the fat, it's good. And so that's where it should be. Obviously, you will have somebody who is overweight, severely overweight. The joints, many of these things will still be impacted because you just carry more weight. But This is obviously side effects, and that's a different story. But on the metabolic health side, that's not so much affected. And so I think really this is a dynamic play which goes back and forth and really can change and adapt to the state that we are in. And so I think one has to look at the individual level. And the other side, and we briefly touched on that before, is the body mass index. That basically tells you something about weight and height and gives you a measure. It's very easy to use, but it slightly ignores the fact that we have different fat depots, and also the relevance for metabolic health is different. Many times we see subcutaneous fat, that's very dynamic. We also see it in our study where we looked at that. There we see much less of these effects compared to this omental or inter-organ fat. That seems to be a bit more problematic. And with this, looking at the waist to hip ratio, that's a measure which is a better way of assessing that. And so there are some efforts or some initiatives which want to bring that more to the clinic to rather classify overweight and also the whole next steps based on the waist to hip ratio. The only problem with that is, and maybe also to mention that, is measuring the BMI is very easy. You stand on the scale, you measure your height, you're done. Waist to hip ratio will depend on where is exactly the waist and where do you exactly measure it and where hip. And so suddenly you do it at two different study sites. These might be confounding. There might be differences. So it becomes a bit more complex. And so that's, despite, I think, the reason that it makes sense, people are still a bit reluctant to straight away jump into that. And I can see why.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually read an article the other day talking about this shift in going from BMI to waist to hip ratio. And then before they talked about the waist to hip ratio, they basically just said, measure the waist. It should be this number below for women and this number below for men. And I thought, you just BMI-ified the better metric. So, leave it to the US. I throw my hands in the air sometimes, But I guess key takeaway, final thoughts, something to wrap this up. What's something that you really want people to know and understand?
I think probably the key message that we found here is that indeed long-term exposure and being obese or living with obesity is a long-term exposure will or can have also long-term consequences even when that is gone. Yet going back to a more healthier stat in most cases, at least for obesity again, we see is really relevant. And maybe the stigmatization is something that really people should not see so much as a real fact of their own weakness, but it's rather we have an inbuilt system which is responsive partially for that.
Absolutely. And I'll add to that, prevention is powerful.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, that's a good point. if you never live with obesity, well, you don't have to read our study because it doesn't affect you. So in that way, that's a very cool point. Prevention is at the end probably the most powerful way to not get there in the first place and don't have to deal with any of these issues.
All right. Well, I think that brings us to our rapid fire off-topic questions. You ready?
I'm ready. Let's see.
All right. What's the best thing you've done for your health this week? What's the naughtiest thing you've done related to your health this week?
Basically, before our interview, I just went for a run. I went for an hour running. So I think that's good. It's refreshes, fresh air. So I think I enjoyed that. The naughtiest thing I've done. I mean, I sometimes do this intermittent fasting. I'm not sure if this is really good. I still kind of like it to be feeling hungry. And so in that way, I think that's something I actually do enjoy doing. It's not always the most pleasant experience, but from all our research, I feel being hungry is good, at least sometimes.
Exactly. At least sometimes. And I'm a big fan of how you do the intermittent fasting. What your hours are makes a big difference. If you weren't a biochemist and a researcher, what would you do?
That's a tricky one. I probably would be more an MD. I would have gone that way, which is not too far away. So it's maybe not a real difference, but it's a kind of very much my family history was pushed. No, pushed not. I basically saw it and I was excited about that. I've never really reconsidered.
Yeah. What favorite book on any topic other than your area of expertise? Or you could give us a fiction book.
A book I'd actually enjoyed a lot because of the bit absurdity is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly because of what is called the trilogy of 5 books. But I think there's many of these ideas of how also our environment and our society changes over time, and a little bit also putting it at a bit of a sarcastic level, looking at that. And I sometimes enjoy thinking about many of these quotes in there.
Yes. If you could cure one ailment, disease, or sickness, what would it be?
I actually think what we're working on is key to many things. So metabolic health, diabetes, in that direction. Because I believe many of the age-related change we see and what we see in metabolic diseases, chronic metabolic disease, are so similar. And even if you think of the implications of cardiovascular risk, even cancer, I mean, you could argue many of them, this is a risk factor for them. And so I think if we would cure that probably would be pretty fantastic.
I'm with you. It would be obesity. All right, if you were a superhero, what would be your superpower?
Never thought about that. I'm not sure if I would want to fly. I mean, flying would be cool. I'm not sure if I really would need it. It's not a very useful power to have, but it's probably fun.
Right. What's your biggest pet peeve?
Sorry, pet?
Oh, yeah, it's like, what's something that like annoys you or just sort of, frustrates you, the little things?
It's more, I think, somewhat inefficiency. I mean, sounds maybe a bit of but I mean, basically, if things fail because of just not people taking care of them, being inefficient, it can be frustrating.
I hear you. All right, last one. In your opinion, what's the next frontier in wellness?
I think this whole aging longevity side, I think this really has a lot of potential. And maybe it doesn't mean that at the end we will be living much longer, but maybe we live much longer healthy. We may still live the same amount of time, the health span. I can see this is really exciting to think about that. But maybe I would add something to that. I think if prevention is being more recognized, because at the end of the day, most of us are actually born healthy, or many of us are.
1,000%.
And so many of the diseases that we are facing nowadays, all of these metabolic diseases, I mean, a good part of that, you could just say this is we do them to ourselves. And so by prevention, by actually bringing that in, also maybe from the medical side, getting that more attention to that and actually rather incentivizing towards prevention rather than treatment in the end, I think that would be fantastic because it would be cheaper and people would be healthy without having to treat the disease. So I think that's maybe even on the treatment side or on the kind of what I would want to change. I think if that would be one of the things, that would be fantastic.
Amazing. Couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much for being here. Tell everybody how to connect with you, where to learn more about all the research you're doing.
Thanks a lot. It was great. I really enjoyed it. It was a fun discussion. And so I hope your listeners also enjoyed that and happy for anything that comes then.
Good. And we'll put links to your social media and your website and those kinds of things if people want to learn more about everything you're up to as well.
Sounds great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you again.
Thanks.
Yes. And friends, on Friday, in this week's Nutrition Nugget bonus episode, we're talking about what we call, or what my mentors call, the microwave mindset. So this was a new phrase to me. I heard it in kind of a continuing ed seminar, and I was like, oh my goodness, yes. So interesting, because I think it actually connects to this week's episode. So if you're curious, we're going to talk all about it on Friday in this week's Nutrition Nugget bonus episode. So be sure wherever you're listening, click the plus sign or the follow button, and then your app will alert you when the Nutrition Nugget goes live. Well, as always, friends, I'm your host, Jenn Trepeck. Connect with me on Instagram or all social media. I'm at Jenn Trepeck, JENNTREPECK. Website is asaladwithasideofries.com. Pick your platform, send a message. I love hearing from you, your takeaways, your ideas, your questions. This is also the easiest way to learn more about working with me as your health coach. Professor Dr. Ferdinand von Meyenn, thank you so much again for being here and joining us.
It was great. Thanks a lot and enjoyed it. And wishing you a wonderful rest of the week. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you. And friends, if you are not already, join our membership by going to glow.fm/saladwithaside-of-fries. This shows your support for this podcast, this community, and most importantly, your health. You'll get this week's recipe for the roasted artichoke hearts and details for your quarterly live Q&A. So until next week, remember, regaining weight we removed can make us feel like there's something wrong with us or like it's a moral failing. In reality, though, there's usually a physiological explanation. And now you know, fat cells have memory. Well, friends, that's it for today's episode of Salad with a Side of Fries. Congratulations for making yourself and your health a priority. Thanks so much for joining us. Be sure to click subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast platform. Share us with a friend, and we'll be back next week. Always remember, you deserve it, and you are worth it. Happy healthy.